I'm not sure that you're aware of this, but there's an awful lot to unpack on the roundtable this morning. So join us, our Democratic political analyst Marianne Marsh and Republican political analyst Lizzie Guyton. It's great to see you guys this morning. You just heard the AG here. She sat in the chair this morning, and we asked her if Biden should step down from the ticket. That's the simple way of the question we asked. Marianne, what do you say?
There's so much to say, Eddie.
So
let's start. The debate Thursday night revealed all of America's flaws right now. Donald Trump, a convicted felon, 34 counts, stood on a stage for 90 minutes, and every time he opened his mouth, he lied. Joe Biden failed to stand up to him because he did not perform, and so he failed. And CNN failed. Jake Tapper and Dana Bash didn't hold anyone accountable in that debate. So now you have on full display how we arrived at this day. As for Joe Biden, it's a tough call. I'm going to sit here today. I don't know whether he will stay in the race, should stay in the race, and if he doesn't, who would replace him? Here's what I know. I know what you can do in one day. When I did John Kerry's Senate race against Bill Weld, in the morning at 11 o'clock, I had to call him after looking at the 10 o'clock numbers and tell him he was losing and what I needed him to do. And then we went through the day, looked at the 2 o'clock numbers, the 4 o'clock numbers. What happened between 10 and 4 and 5? Ugly.
Yeah.
But at 5 o'clock, I knew we were going to win.
Yeah.
And from 5 to 8, I refused to tell anybody we were going to win because I wanted to crush Bill Weld for putting me through this.
Yeah.
We won by 8 points. So I know what you can do in one day. There are 127 days left. And here's the question for Democrats. Can Joe Biden continue to be the candidate that beats Donald Trump? And to do that, you need data. You need facts. And if you do decide he is not the one, then how do you get him to agree to step down? And who do you replace him with?
Right.
Because that's no small feat either.
Right.
So the Democrats are in a really tough position, and it only gets tougher from here. We can do hard things, but this is going to be really hard.
Lizzie, what do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, last night we saw a halting performance from President Biden. It was worse than anybody thought, and it really asks the question of what is next. We're not talking about a gaffe or a flub on a policy comment. It's not policy or politics. It's his mental capacity and his ability to hold the office. So now we're having a lot of conversations that we weren't having 24 hours ago, and now a lot more people are concerned not only about President Biden being able to run for office, but what's going to happen down ticket for all these other Democrats that have elections, and is it going to have an impact on their race? Marianne, I agree. It's, a lot is going to happen now, and there's a lot of conversations, I think, starting that people weren't anticipating having. But I also think that now the American people are a lot more concerned than they were before, because it's really hard to believe the trust that the White House has been saying Biden's fine, he's doing push-ups, he's on the ball, he's running around. How could we trust that after what we saw last night with our own eyes? And what does the world think of what they saw last night about what the United States is doing?
Should he step down? I mean, should he just remove himself from the equation?
I think if President Biden doesn't make a change and doesn't step down, that the Democrats will be handing this election to President Trump.
Well, I want to ask you about voters on sort of who don't like either candidate. We've heard a lot from voters who say, I don't want either of these guys. What happens with them? Who do they choose?
Well, I think, let's go back for a second. I think there's a bigger question here. The Democrats get one shot at this decision. It's not a simple, he didn't perform last night and you got to get rid of him. It's like, who do you replace him with? And the complicating factors there are endless. And the down ballot races, I'm not worried about because they were running ahead of Biden anyways, okay? So they're fine. The question is, who do you replace them? If you do, with whom? And it is not clear to me any of the people we've been talking about for 2028 is prepared for this. I'm not worried about the double haters. There are 6 states you got to do. But if you reboot with someone not Joe Biden's either got to show everybody that Thursday night was an aberration, not the pattern. And if he can't do that, you are turning this country over to Donald Trump, who will end the democracy, end the world economy, end democracies around the world. The stakes could not be higher.
Well, Lizzie, what do you think about all that?
It's stunning that we're having these conversations. You have Trump. Trump did what he needed to do last night. He showed up. He brought it back to the issues he wants to talk about. He wants to talk about the past. He wants to talk about immigration. He wants to talk about the economy. But it didn't even matter because Biden was incoherent. He was not capable of prosecuting Trump for his record. He was not capable of giving, neither one of
struggled
them
to
were,
criticize
for
him.
giving the American people a path forward. What are we going to do about all these challenges facing our country right now? Neither candidate addressed that, and Biden wasn't even strong on some of his own issues.
And to underscore what you said, as Marianne said earlier, I hate the lie word. I do hate that. But Donald Trump spoke perhaps untruths all night long, and
He
yet
lied.
we're talking about the performance.
We're talking about Biden.
We're talking about
We're talking
Biden's
about
performance.
Biden. Exactly.
But Donald Trump literally lied every single time he opened his mouth. He didn't answer a question. He didn't offer a solution. It was like watching a Trump rally. I watch all of them in a debate. And he went unchallenged.
But still, there is nothing that I could say or any Republican could say that would darken the performance that Joe Biden had last night.
Quickly, did the debate format help or hurt either candidate? What do you think?
Helped Trump hurt Biden.
What do you think?
I agree. And, particularly the split screens, Biden's facial expressions, and Trump being muted at certain points gave him more of a controlled environment and, frankly, more composure.
We're on the record. Stay with us.